8 senators issued a statement today in support of Jody Wilson-Raybould. They expressed admiration for her work and her character. The statement reads in part, "Her contributions will leave a lasting mark in history and will serve as an inspiration for Indigenous people, women and youth to contribute to their communities and politics. Even though some will see this as a threat to the promise and process of reconciliation, it is not. It is a measure of the distance we have yet to go and the challenges we have yet to overcome. So long as Ms. Wilson-Raybould and other men and women like her gain and remain on the national scene and show the integrity we need to persevere on this journey, change will occur." How should this message from senators be interpreted, and how unusual is this public commentary on the cabinet makeup? Time for the Power Panel. In Calgary, journalist Jen Gerson. Supriya Dwivedi, host of Global News Radio's Toronto 640 AM morning show, is in Toronto, along with Andrew Thompson, former Saskatchewan Finance Minister and Chief of Government Relations for U of T. And here with me in studio, Summa Strategy's Tim Powers and the CBC's very own Jorge Barrera. Hi, everyone. Great to see you. Thanks for being with us, Jorge. I'll start with you. How do you read that statement?
Well, I think the part about reconciliation, there's a difference between the process, the overall process of reconciliation that requires participation from, academic institutes, from municipal governments, provincial governments, civic groups, to the governments. There's a difference between that process and the government's reconciliation agenda. So in the second part, where they said, it shows how much we still have to go, I think that was really telling, because I believe that with this whole scandal, it really has had an impact on the credibility from the position of, First Nations leadership, Indigenous legal groups, to the Trudeau government's reconciliation agenda, the commitment to it, some of the things that have come out in this. And right in the initial story, there was this part deep in the story about how apparently Clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Wernick, had privately rebuked Wilson-Raybould over a series of speeches she had given, questioning the commitment and the pushback she had faced. So I think that statement, those two parts, they go together. I think reconciliation is bigger than a government, but because of this, it shows how much we have to go.
Right.
What's really fascinating about this, so I think strategically we saw earlier in the week, Prime Minister's press conference that you covered, I believe it was from Winnipeg, when he decided it looked like to do what was happening on background through other sources, go after Jody Wilson-Raybould, to challenge Jody Wilson-Raybould, to question her motives, to plant seeds of doubt. So what we've seen since then, though, is a very strong pushback, not from Jody Wilson-Raybould, but a lot of other people who are turning her into, whether it is deserved or not right now, an iconic figure who stood up and is standing up against something that people want her to stand up against. So if you're in the Prime Minister's office and you're the Prime Minister, you got to be thinking, did we miscalculate this? Because you will have, and I'm sure you've had this, and Jorge's had this, people who will say, look, from the government, this is really being blown out of proportion.
Wayne Easter said that a few minutes ago on the show. Mountain out of a molehill.
We really want Jody to speak so it can all be clearly understood. Well, you can fix that problem, but in the meantime, while you attack her, while you look to undermine her, whatever she says is going to be even more potent when it comes out. I'm not sure you want to take the strategy you're taking.
There were some additional comments today, Supriya, from Liberal MP Anthony Housefather, who's been on the show a number of times this week because he chairs that Justice Committee, which is going to look into this to some capacity. He was on a radio station in Montreal. He said, he was asked kind of about the possible reasons for Ms. Wilson-Raybould's move from Justice, the Justice portfolio, to Veterans Affairs. And he said there's a lot of legal issues coming up in Quebec, and the Prime Minister may well have decided he needed a Justice Minister that could speak French. What do you think of that?
Yeah, he made those remarks on CJD, and I think it's interesting because he has since tweeted out that it's clear from the context of the quote that he was basically just giving out one of the other reasons that possibly could be, and that, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's basically silly for everyone to be speculating as to why anyone would be demoted. But of course, in the absence of any information, that's exactly what people tend to do, is to fill the gaps with their own speculation. I do think some of the conclusions that people are drawing from this are a little bit hard on Mr. Housefather, but I will say if you don't want people to draw these sorts of conclusions, then you should tighten up your comms around the issue. And that has been, the fundamental problem thus far with this entire SNC Gate, Ghazi, L'Affaire SNC, whatever you want to call it, is the fact that we're now a week out from this, and the comms have been all over the place. I mean, it took today, I believe, finally from the PMO's office, for them, APTN reported this earlier today, to finally rebuke all of those anonymous Liberal sources that had been speaking to the Canadian press, you know, smearing Ms. Wilson-Raybould, basically calling her everything short of the B word. Why did it take you so long to do that? Like, if that's the kind of messaging that you wanted to ensure that wasn't going to get out there, as soon as those comments were out, something should have been issued. It shouldn't have taken, you know, a release from Indigenous groups and other people on Twitter and politicos kind of raising their eyes, being like, wow, this strikes a blow to the, you know, so-called woke feminist Prime Minister. So all this to say, the actual scandal at the heart of it, I think there's very little substance to it. It's how everything around it thus far has gone forward.
Andrew, what do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. This can't be a good situation. I mean, this was obviously going to be a bit of an issue in terms of the interference. I still think the heart of this is the question of corruption. But it's around some pretty boring issues otherwise. This whole question about deferred prosecution agreements makes one's eyes roll up in their head. What I think is fascinating, though, is the response to this is what was looking like a bit of a fire on top of the stove. They've now somehow managed to catch the curtains on fire and the sofa and the cat, and everybody's angry at them about something.
Don't hurt the cat.
Yeah.
Exactly. Don't get the cats angry at you. But this is a big issue because now they've got all sorts of other groups who are feeling aggrieved by this. And politically, this can't be good for them. We have now seen them now needing to fight this on multiple fronts. The Indigenous reconciliation issues, the issue around feminism, the role of women, who speaks for women in this cabinet. And I think it's starting to call into question the whole strategy around this identity politics, which is starting to make it look like as long as these other people are in the cabinet to support the Prime Minister, that's their entire function. It's not really about driving forward the rest of the agenda, about promoting a bigger role for women or for Indigenous people or for others. And that has got to be toxic, and it's got to be really problematic for the Liberal brand.
That's an interesting point that I'd like to get Jen to weigh in on.
Oh man, I've got a lot of things to say after all of those panelists. Yeah, I don't think that there's any dispute that whatever reputation this government and this Prime Minister and this Prime Minister's office more broadly had for, being, the feminist or the feminist government. It's 2015. Well, it's obviously not 2015 anymore now, is it? A lot of the language that anonymously slipped out, it's almost, I mean, some of those vicious stuff really all has been anonymous, has been so obviously gendered. And I think that, as a mouthy, angry, salty woman myself, I mean, I've heard this stuff. I understand where this stuff comes from. It's impossible to ignore the fact that, a lot of it is playing to stereotypes about women, about the way women in power behave and the way that they're supposed to behave, the way that they're supposed to get along, work for the team, not be too ambitious, all that kind of stuff. So, like, I've said this on Twitter, but I mean, you can talk a good feminist game about all this stuff, but unless you're actually willing to examine how you think women are supposed to behave in positions of leadership and not be holding them to an unfair double standard, it's all really just talk. And I think that is what this scandal's revealed about this Prime Minister and this cabinet. I would go further to say that I think it's profoundly unfair that Wilson-Raybould is having to fend off attacks on a near daily basis about how difficult she is or how talented she was on this file or the individual failings of this particular piece of legislation versus that one, when it's very clear that she, by convention, can't speak about her role generally as a justice minister, and specifically feels that she can't speak to this scandal in any detailed way because of client solicitor privilege, the client solicitor privilege that this government has refused to waive. I mean, it's one thing for them to say, to put Justin Trudeau out in the middle of the camera and say, well, Jody Wilson-Raybould should have come to me if she felt that she was being pressured, but then to put the other person on the other side of this in a position where she can't confirm, deny, respond to that. There's an inequity of power there that I think a lot of people are responding against and taking a lot of offense to, and very rightly. Tim?
What's really interesting is usually with stories like this, so-called scandals, whether this is a real one or not, we'll know over time what impact it has, we'll know over time. a government or whoever is being attacked or on the defensive usually gets better at managing things. They don't continue to add fuel to the fire, but with every day, it is the government that's doing the work for the opposition and its opponents. I mean, today, you mentioned it a few moments ago, Mr. Housefather, the chair of the Judicial Committee, throwing this line out about, well, she didn't speak French. Well, I used to work for a guy by the name of John Crosbie, who was a justice minister who didn't speak French either. That wasn't a disqualifying element.
And
it's
also,
like
what is the chair of the Judicial Committee doing making that statement in public? And how much faith can we have in the Judicial Committee when they're preemptively defending the government and taking these types of lines?
Well, he's admitted that. To be fair, he's admitted that before and acknowledged that, yeah, I come from a partisan point of view, so do the Conservatives and the NDP on this committee, and therefore I'm worried about our ability to get to the bottom of it.
But he stepped in
that he did it. Now, does it?
But when he spoke to you this week, I believe he said, and I'm paraphrasing, that he was going to try and create an environment where it was nonpartisan. It's hard to switch out of those roles. I'll give you that. But he ran that committee yesterday. He saw the critique that has emerged post-committee about how it went. And then to have this come out again, they're not helping themselves.
How important, Jorge, do you think it is that the Prime Minister, and I know there's a legal consideration here, but waives that privilege so that we can actually hear from Jody Wilson-Raybould? And if he doesn't, what are the potential consequences?
Well, it's huge because it's all about the pressure. Was there pressure exerted? I mean, that's the core. That was the core of that story. That's what made it so explosive. And all this stuff, all this different talks, all this different messaging is all about avoiding that. And I think it will continue to smolder and flame and flare up and maybe
more cats will get burned.
More cats.
Hopefully not.
We don't want the SPCA mad at us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole house could come down, right? I mean, this is a really, really volatile situation. So yes, what she has to say is really, really important to actually find some way, some doorway to some sort of resolution. But I think what the government has been doing is avoiding that core question, the pressure. Was there pressure? Who exerted that pressure? What did it look like? And I think it will continue until we actually get to that core issue.
Andrew, quick point, then I'll go to the break.
Yeah, but the funny thing is that there's actually an argument here that the Prime Minister could be making, which is saying that really he is, it's the argument he's making in Quebec, he's there to protect the jobs. So yes, of course, he's going to fight for that. The problem is it's all been lost now. There's so much smoke and heat on this thing.
Well, the other thing is if there was actual pressure that was exerted back in September when this alleged conversation is supposed to have taken place, why didn't she resign? If there was a violation of the Shawcross Doctrine, that's when she should have resigned. The timeline is set.
That's the pending question, and until
sure, but the timeline, but the chronology of this does not work out. The timeline is the conversation happened in September. The deferred prosecution agreement or remediation didn't actually happen in October. That's when they were like, okay, we're going to go through with the actual trial. Fast forward to last month.
We're assuming one conversation here. Supriya, the problem with what you're saying here is that no. So you're assuming one conversation as opposed to what might have been a series of cumulative pressure that culminated in her being demoted. That's why we need to actually hear.
Yeah, but I think Supriya's making the point that we've heard from the Prime Minister. If in fact in September Jody Wilson-Raybould felt pressure, she was under obligation to resign at that point. The problem is the Prime Minister is able to make that point. We are not able to hear a rebuttal from Jody Wilson-Raybould because the Prime Minister has not waived privilege to allow her to speak.
I'm not convinced that she had to resign in that situation. Why would she have to?
Shawcross Doctrine says. So yeah.
So you have to confront the Prime Minister on it and take it up. And the question is, did she or did she not?
But this isn't a willy-nilly rule. Like, this
is
an actual legal principle.
On that note of what we don't know, we have to take a break. The roots of the controversy stem back months ago when the government included something in its massive budget bill, the creation of so-called deferred prosecution agreements, or DPAs. They're like plea deals, kind of. Companies can use them to negotiate a fine, usually a big one, instead of facing prosecution. The opposition is accusing the Liberals of sneaking that into the budget implementation bill so they could later use it to help SNC-Lavalin. So why was it added to the bill in the first place? Wayne Easter is a Liberal MP and chair of the House Committee on Finance. He joins me now from Charlottetown. Hi, Mr. Easter. Great to see you. Thank you for your time.
Hi, Bessie. Good.
As we said, you chair the Finance Committee, the committee that studied the budget implementation bill. Deferred prosecution agreements ended up being a part of it. Why did the government put it in there?
Well, there's as you've indicated, there's lots of things in a budget implementation act. And this one had included in it Part 6, which included the remediation agreements. And there is an economic side to that as well, beside the justice side. I mean, the whole purpose of it, I think, was Canada catching up to the United States and some other countries on how do you put together an arrangement so that you do not cause economic damage to certain areas of the countries, to workers and their pensions, while at the same time applying penalties under the law.
Mr. Easter, it's my understanding, though, that while actually in other countries DPAs do take into account the economic impact, the version that ended up becoming law in Canada does not.
Yes, it's still. We had a counsel, chief counsel from Department of Justice before us. We made a couple of amendments to that section as well. And if you go back to that testimony, you will see where there is proportional penalties to the crime. And we added an amendment that would cover some of the damage to the victims as a result of that crime exercised by that corporation.
But in the actual part of the budget implementation bill that was passed, does it anywhere say that in the potential economic impact, for example, in the case of SNC, that the company it would be tons of jobs on the line, thousands of Canadian jobs on the line? It's my understanding that in Canada, when coming to a decision whether to reach a DPA, that is not part of the factors. That is not under consideration.
Well, it's my understanding that it is, so I guess we differ on that opinion. And if you go back to the testimony and some of the testimony from the witness that we had there, those are important factors. And while, and in this discussion, I would be absolutely shocked if there wasn't discussions on the economic impact of penalties when many jobs are involved.
Should changes to the criminal code be made in a budget implementation bill?
Well, we questioned that at the committee ourselves. I did myself. Sometimes we do farm out certain sections to other committees. The Justice Committee seemed pretty preoccupied while the budget bill was going through, and so we didn't farm it out. There was questions raised on whether or not we should have, but there was no motions coming forward to, in fact, send it to the Justice Committee.
Though opposition members did raise it.
I did myself.
You raised the concern?
I raised it. Is this the right committee to be discussing this at? And there was no motions coming forward to send it to the Justice Committee.
Did you ever raise those concerns elsewhere with the government, for example?
I raised them in several places with finance officials and with the House Leader's office. But I think you also have to understand, you're looking at the whole of government here in terms of it getting its legislative package through in a timely manner. And that's why several things come into a budget bill, and there is a tie-in into the economic issues related to the country in this section.
So just so I'm clear, though, was the basic reasoning that you were given because the Justice Committee had too many things on its plate? They couldn't examine changes like this to the criminal code?
We never got that far into the discussion.
Do you, I guess, understand the questions Canadians have around the optics of the timeline? You've got extensive lobbying by SNC, a quick consultation, and then this DPA section is slipped into an omnibus bill and pushed through just in time for the prosecution to consider it in the criminal case.
I understand the concerns of Canadians. There's no question about that. I think there's more been made of this issue than needs to be made of the issue. But that be as it may, the opposition is going to try and make a mountain out of a molehill. I do think we have to deal with this issue quickly and concisely. The Justice Committee is, in fact, holding a meeting, I understand, I believe it's on Tuesday, and they will do as they will. They're masters of their own destiny in that regard, and we'll see where they come out on it.
What do you mean making a mountain out of a molehill? You think Ms. Jody Wilson-Rayboud's resignation is not significant?
Her resignation is significant. It's not the first resignation I've seen from Cabinet, and there's a lot of talk about it. Was there pressure applied? Look, there's always pressure in government. I've been in Cabinet. And what one person sees as pressure, another may see as just a day's work. I'm really sad to see Jody Wilson-Raybould go. I think she did a very good job as Justice Minister. She was, there was some excitement here in Prince Edward Island having her as Veterans Affairs Minister. But that's a decision she made, and that's entirely her decision, and she'll have to explain it as she may.
What do you mean by one person's definition of pressure is different than another? Just, I mean, well, she's insinuating. I mean, this is just to be clear, though. The allegation in the Globe and Mail is that the type of pressure she felt was to intervene in a criminal case as AG, at the urging of people in the Prime Minister's office.
Well, look, there's discussions take place, and some people think that I go back quite a ways. I've been elected for 25 years. I've been in Chrétien's cabinet. And if you wanted to see some of the discussions that we had around that cabinet, there was lots of pressure. You could feel really insulted over it or taken aback. People look at these issues in different ways. And so I think it's too bad that she resigned. But I tell you, I would be very, very disappointed if on an issue of this magnitude, where there's jobs, where there's people's pensions involved, if there wasn't a healthy discussion. I think that had to be had. If there was undue pressure, then that's another story.
Yeah, that's the difference. And I take your point about uncomfortable discussions, and cabinet is a different place, and I understand what you're saying there. But I think the reason that this has raised the ire of some Canadians is because we're not just talking about any situation or any personnel disagreement. You're talking about an allegation of trying to get involved in a criminal case for a very big corporation, a wealthy corporation that, yes, employs a lot of Canadians, but also is facing a lot of criminal charges and allegations of corruption and bribery.
Vassie, that allegation is coming from an anonymous source.
So it's fake news?
For whatever reason. That's where the allegation is coming from. Let's see who's making that allegation, and then it will go forward.
Well, we'd all love to hear from Jody Wilson-Raybould, but the Prime Minister has to waive privilege.
The Prime Minister has made it very, very clear that he supports the rule of law. He wants the rule of law respected, and I believe he said in his discussions as well that this would be the Minister of Justice, who was Minister of Justice at the time. That would be her decision to make in discussions with the federal.
But we haven't heard from her yet because the Prime Minister has yet to waive privilege.
That's beyond my level.
Okay, Mr. Easter. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Take care. Bye-bye.